Okay, let's jump right into the new 2025-2030 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Now, these represent a really major shift in our national nutrition policy. So in this explainer, we're going to break it all down and give you a practical, clinical guide you can actually use when you're counseling your patients.
Here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll look at the why behind these new guidelines, the health emergency that sparked them. Then, we'll talk about the new real food reset philosophy. After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty, how to build a nutrient-dense plate, what foods to limit, and finally, we'll cover some specific guidance for the special populations you see every day in your practice.
So, why the big change? Well, these guidelines are a direct response to a massive public health crisis, one that you as clinicians are on the front lines of every single day. Let's just look at some of the numbers.
Get this. Over 70% of American adults are now considered overweight or obese. And you know this isn't just a number on a chart. It is the primary engine driving the metabolic diseases we are constantly battling in our clinics, everything from insulin resistance to type 2 diabetes and heart disease.
And it's starting so much younger. Right now, nearly 1 in 3 American adolescents has prediabetes. I mean, that is just a staggering statistic. It points to a huge future wave of endocrine disorders and really highlights just how urgent effective nutritional counseling has become.
You know, the impact of this crisis actually goes way beyond the clinic. The guidelines point out that these diet-driven diseases are now affecting national security because so many young people are disqualified from military service. It's a pretty stark reminder of how deeply our national diet affects every part of our society.
Okay, so that's the problem. In response, the new guidelines propose a really fundamental change in our whole approach, and they're calling it the real food reset.
And let me be clear, this is not just a minor update. The source document itself calls this the most significant reset of federal nutrition policy ever. That's a huge signal that the old ways of counseling patients might need a serious overhaul. We're really talking about a paradigm shift here.
So what is this new paradigm? Well, it all boils down to one simple, powerful message that you can give your patients. Eat real food. This moves the focus away from, counting every single nutrient and instead promotes a whole foods approach that's just so much easier for patients to actually understand and, more importantly, to follow.
All right, let's get practical. How do we actually translate eat real food into a meal plan? This next section is all about building that nutrient-dense plate, piece by piece. First up, there's a really strong new emphasis on prioritizing protein. The goal is to aim for 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight each day. Now, this range is absolutely crucial for promoting satiety, for preserving that lean muscle mass, especially during weight loss, and for supporting overall metabolic health. The guidelines also really stress getting a variety of high-quality sources and, of course, using healthier cooking methods.
And as you can see here, the emphasis is really on variety. So whether your patient prefers animal-based proteins like chicken and fish, or they're more into plant-based options like beans and nuts, the key is to include high-quality protein at every single meal. That's what's going to support their metabolic health and keep them feeling full.
This chart really lays out the whole swap mentality perfectly. We're advising patients to prioritize things like colorful whole veggies and fruits, fiber-rich whole grains, and even full-fat unsweetened dairy. And at the same time, we're asking them to reduce things like juice, refined carbs like white bread, and all those sugary low-fat dairy products. It's a really clear visual guide for making better choices.
The guidelines also now explicitly include healthy fats from whole food sources. And this is a really crucial point for endocrine health. So foods like eggs, avocados, nuts, and that omega-3 rich seafood are being presented as absolutely essential parts of a healthy diet.
Okay, so building a healthy plate is just as much about what you leave off of it as what you put on it, right? So let's now look at the recommendations for limiting the foods that we know drive chronic disease.
The number one target for reduction is highly processed foods. You know the ones, products that are loaded with added sugars, sodium, and all sorts of artificial ingredients. Think sugary drinks, packaged snacks, and those ready-to-eat meals that are just packed with calories but have almost no real nutritional value.
And to help with this, the guidelines give us a really practical tool for our patients, a list of all the different names for added sugars. Teaching patients how to spot words like high fructose corn syrup, or dextrose, or fruit juice concentrate on a label is so empowering. It lets them make their own informed choices.
And for the first time ever,
We have specific quantified limits for added sugar. We're talking no more than 10 grams in a meal, 5 grams for a grain-based snack, and just 2.5 grams for a dairy snack. These are concrete, measurable targets you can actually give your patients to aim for. So the big question is, how do you actually apply all of these rules to your patients? Well, this final section provides some really tailored guidance that you can apply directly in your practice.
For your patients with chronic diseases, the guidelines now clearly state that this whole food pattern can slow disease progression. But crucially, they now explicitly mention that a lower carbohydrate diet may be beneficial, and they advise patients to work with their clinician to adapt the plan. This is a huge endorsement of a therapeutic tool that I know many of you are already using.
For pregnant women, where endocrine health is obviously paramount, the focus really shifts to meeting those increased needs for specific micronutrients. So the advice is to prioritize foods that are rich in things like iron, folate, iodine, choline, and calcium.
Now, for older adults, the big challenge is meeting their nutrient needs while consuming fewer calories. So the guidelines emphasize maximizing nutrient density with foods like dairy, meats, eggs, and seafood to make sure they're getting enough protein, B12, vitamin D, and calcium.
And for your vegetarian or vegan patients, the guidelines really highlight the importance of careful planning to avoid those common nutrient gaps. The key here is to monitor for potential deficiencies in B12, iron, vitamin D, and calcium, and to make sure you're using targeted supplementation when needed.
So if you remember one thing from all of this, let it be this. The key takeaway is the shift away from a rigid nutrient-by-nutrient focus to a much more flexible, pattern-based approach that's centered on whole foods. This framework is just so much more adaptable to the really diverse clinical needs of your patients.
You see, the real power of these new guidelines is in their simplicity and their flexibility. The old, confusing rules are pretty much gone. So now, the real work begins right there in the clinic, with you. The question to ask yourself is, how can you take this real food framework and personalize it to empower each of your patients on their own journey to long-term metabolic health?